What happens when Hollywood's most iconic tough guy gets pushed too far by a talk show host who forgot his place? In just 41 seconds of uncomfortable silence, Graham Norton's smug grin would vanish completely as Clint Eastwood stood up and walked off his set, leaving the host speechless and humiliated in front of millions. The atmosphere in the studio that night felt different from the start. Clint Eastwood walked onto the stage with his usual calm, collected demeanor. The audience erupted in applause. This was a legend, after all. A man who had given the world unforgettable films, unforgettable characters, and unforgettable moments. He settled into the bright red chair, nodding politely at Graham Norton, who was already wearing that signature cheeky smile he's known for. But something was off. Norton's energy seemed more aggressive than usual, more pointed. He started the interview pleasantly enough, asking Clint about his latest project. Clint answered with his trademark brevity, calm and measured. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to talk about his work, respect the craft, and go home. Simple as that. Then, Norton shifted gears. His tone changed. The questions became more personal, more invasive. He started asking about Clint's age, making jokes about how long he'd been in the industry. The audience laughed nervously. Clint's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. He'd been in this business long enough to handle a few jabs. "So Clint," Norton said, leaning forward with that grin growing wider, "you've been making films since what? The Stone Age? Do you ever think about just, calling it quits? Letting the younger generation take over?" The audience went quiet. You could feel the tension building. Clint looked at Norton with those steely eyes, the same eyes that had stared down countless villains on screen. He paused for a moment, then responded calmly. "I'll quit when I feel like quitting, not when someone else thinks I should." Norton laughed it off, but there was an edge to it now. He wasn't used to guests pushing back. He was used to compliance, to people playing along with whatever game he wanted to play. But Clint Eastwood wasn't just anyone. He wasn't going to sit there and be disrespected for entertainment value. Norton pressed on, clearly feeling emboldened by the audience's nervous laughter. "But surely you must see it, Clint. The industry has changed. Maybe it's passed you by. Maybe your style of filmmaking is a bit, outdated." The room felt like all the air had been sucked out of it. Other guests on the couch shifted uncomfortably. Audience members exchanged glances. This wasn't playful banter anymore. This was a host publicly undermining a guest, a legend, for cheap laughs. Clint sat perfectly still. His face remained neutral, but anyone who knew anything about him could see the warning signs. The slight narrowing of his eyes. The way his hands rested just a bit, more firmly on the armrests. He was giving Norton a chance to back down, to move on, to show some respect. Norton didn't take the hint. Instead, he doubled down. Come on, Clint. When was the last time you made something that actually mattered? Something that connected with people? You're basically coasting on your reputation at this point, aren't you?" That was the line. The line Norton should never have crossed. The audience gasped. One of the other guests actually said, "Oh no," under their breath. But Norton kept smiling, kept looking at Clint like he'd just delivered the most clever observation in television history. Clint took a slow breath. He looked down for a moment, then back up at Norton. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried across the entire studio with absolute clarity. "You know what your problem is, Graham. You think being rude is the same thing as being funny. You think tearing people down makes you clever. It doesn't. It just makes you small." Norton's smile faltered. Just for a second, but everyone saw it. He tried to laugh it off, waving his hand dismissively. "Oh, come on now, Clint. Don't be so sensitive. It's just a bit of fun. This is what we do here. We have a laugh." "At whose expense?" Clint asked, his voice still calm, still controlled. "You invited me here. I came out of respect for your show and your audience. But respect is a two-way street. You don't get to insult me on your stage and call it entertainment. Norton shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable now. The power dynamic had completely flipped. He was no longer the witty host in control. He was a man who'd bitten off more than he could chew, and everyone in that studio knew it. Look, Clint, I think you're taking this the wrong way, Norton said, his tone shifting to something more placating. I'm just trying to have a conversation. That's all this is. No, Clint said firmly. What you're trying to do is make yourself look good by making me look bad. And I'm not interested in participating in that. Norton tried to recover, tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. He asked about Clint's family, but his voice had lost its confidence. The audience could sense it. The other guests could sense it. And Clint definitely sensed it. But Norton couldn't help himself. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was panic. Maybe he just couldn't read the room. Whatever it was, he made one final, catastrophic mistake. He brought up one of Clint's old relationships, making a crude joke about it. The kind of joke that had no place in any conversation, let alone a televised interview. The kind of joke that showed a complete lack of class, of boundaries, of basic human decency. The audience didn't laugh this time. They sat in stunned silence. Even Norton seemed to realize immediately that he'd gone too far. His face went pale. He opened his mouth to say something, probably to apologize, but it was too late. Clint Eastwood stood up, slowly, deliberately. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at Norton with an expression that conveyed everything that needed to be said. Disappointment, disgust, complete and utter lack of respect for the man sitting across from him. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. I've sat through a lot of interviews in my life. Good ones, bad ones, everything in between. But I have never, and I mean never, been treated with such blatant disrespect. You invited me here as a guest, and you've spent the entire time trying to humiliate me. Why? For ratings? For laughs? Whatever the reason, it's not worth my time. Norton tried to interject, his voice cracking slightly. Clint, please, I didn't mean to... Yes, you did, Clint cut him off. You meant every word. You thought you could take shots at me, and I'd just sit here and take it, because that's what guests do on your show. But I'm not most guests, and I don't play games with people who don't know how to show respect. He reached down and removed his microphone, carefully placing it on the chair he'd just vacated. The action was simple, but it carried enormous weight. This was a man who'd had enough, who was drawing a line, who was standing up for his dignity in the face of someone who'd tried to strip it away. Norton was visibly panicking now. Clint, come on, let's just talk about this. I'm sorry if I offended you. That wasn't my intention. Clint paused for a moment, looking at Norton one last time. Your intentions don't matter when your actions say everything I need to know about your character. And then he walked, straight across the stage, past the band, past the cameras, past the stunned producers. He didn't storm off in anger. He didn't make a scene. He simply left with the same dignity and composure he'd carried with him when he arrived. The audience watched in complete silence. Some of them looked sympathetic. Others looked shocked, but all of them understood what they'd just witnessed. Norton sat frozen in his chair, his face a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. The other guests didn't know where to look. The cameras didn't know what to focus on. For several long, agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The show, which thrived on energy and banter and controlled chaos, had come to a complete standstill. Finally, Norton tried to salvage the situation. He turned to the camera with a weak smile, attempting to brush off what had just happened. Well, that was unexpected. Clint Eastwood, everyone. Strong, silent type indeed. But the joke landed flat. The audience didn't laugh. They just sat there, uncomfortable and unsure. Norton's usual confidence had evaporated entirely. He tried to continue with the show, moving on to the next guest, but the energy was gone. The magic was broken. Everyone in that studio knew they'd just watched a host get put in his place by someone who absolutely deserved better. Treatment. What made the whole thing even more striking was Clint's restraint. He could have shouted. He could have insulted Norton right back. He could have made a massive scene that would have turned the whole thing into a spectacle. But he didn't. He simply stood his ground, said what needed to be said, and left. That took more strength than any outburst ever could. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more stark. On one side, you had Clint Eastwood, a man who'd built a legendary career on talent, hard work, and integrity. A man who demanded respect not because of ego, but because he'd earned it through decades of excellence. A man who knew his worth and wouldn't let anyone diminish it, no matter how big their platform was. On the other side, you had Graham Norton, a host who'd let his position go to his head, who'd confused having a microphone with having the right to say whatever he wanted, who'd thought that his role as interviewer gave him license to mock and belittle his guests, and who'd learned, in the most public way possible, that there are consequences to treating people poorly. The whole exchange highlighted something important about the entertainment industry and about human interaction in general. Just because someone agrees to come on your show, to sit in your chair, to answer your questions, doesn't mean they've surrendered their dignity. It doesn't mean you own them for that segment, and it certainly doesn't mean you can treat them however you want without repercussions. Clint Eastwood understood this implicitly. He'd given Norton multiple chances to course correct, to show some basic decency, to treat him like a human being rather than a prop for jokes. But when those chances were squandered, when the disrespect continued and even escalated, he did the only thing a person with self-respect could do. He removed himself from the situation. Norton, on the other hand, seemed to operate under the assumption that his guests were there to serve him, to feed his comedy, to be the setup for his punchlines. He forgot, or perhaps never learned, that an interview is supposed to be a conversation between equals. Yes, the host guides the discussion, but that doesn't make them superior to the guest. It just gives them a different role to play. The really telling moment came when Clint called out the fundamental flaw in Norton's approach. You think being rude is the same thing as being funny. That one line cut right to the heart of the problem. Norton had built his style around a certain edginess, a willingness to push boundaries and make cheeky observations. But somewhere along the way, edgy had become mean. Cheeky had become cruel, and he'd lost sight of the line between playful teasing and genuine disrespect. What Clint did by walking off that stage wasn't about being thin-skinned or unable to take a joke. It was about setting boundaries. It was about saying, clearly and firmly, that some behavior is unacceptable regardless of the context. It was about showing that fame and success don't mean you have to tolerate mistreatment, even if that mistreatment is disguised as entertainment. The audience's reaction throughout the exchange told its own story. At first, they laughed nervously when Norton made his initial age-related jokes. They were willing to go along with what seemed like standard talk show banter. But as the tone shifted, as the questions became more pointed and the comments more cutting, their laughter died out. They could sense that something was wrong. They could see that this had crossed from entertainment into something uglier. When Clint finally stood up to leave, the silence in that studio was deafening. It was the sound of an audience realizing they'd just watched someone get bullied on live television. It was the sound of people understanding that what they'd initially laughed at wasn't actually funny. It was the sound of collective discomfort and recognition that a line had been crossed. Norton's attempt to play it off afterward, to make light of what had happened, only made things worse. It showed that even in the face of such a clear rejection, such an obvious statement about his behavior, he still didn't fully grasp what he'd done wrong. He still wanted to frame it as Clint being overly sensitive rather than owning up to his own poor choices. The dynamic between host and guest is supposed to be collaborative. The guest brings their story, their personality, their experiences. The host creates the space for those things to shine, asks the questions that help draw them out, and facilitates a conversation that's engaging for the audience. It's a partnership, not a competition. Norton forgot that, or maybe he never understood it in the first place. Clint's professionalism throughout the entire ordeal was remarkable. Even as he was being insulted, even as Norton kept pushing and pushing, he maintained his composure. He didn't resort to name-calling. He didn't throw insults back. He simply stated the facts as he saw them, calmly and clearly. That kind of self-control, that ability to stay grounded even in a hostile situation, is rare. It's the mark of someone who's genuinely confident in themselves and doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. The moment when Clint removed his microphone was particularly powerful. Such a simple action, but loaded with meaning. He wasn't ripping it off in anger. He wasn't throwing it down. He was carefully, deliberately disconnecting himself from the show. It was methodical. It was final. And it was absolutely devastating in its quiet decisiveness. When Norton tried that last desperate appeal, asking Clint to stay, saying he was sorry, you could hear the panic in his voice. He knew the show was falling apart. He knew he'd made a terrible mistake. But by that point, sorry wasn't enough. The damage was done. The disrespect had been shown, and no amount of backpedaling could undo what everyone had seen and heard. Clint's final words before leaving carried so much weight. Your intentions don't matter when your actions say everything I need to know about your character. That's a lesson that applies far beyond talk shows and celebrity interviews. It's a fundamental truth about human interaction. You can claim all day long that you didn't mean to hurt someone, that you were just joking, that they're being too sensitive. But if your actions consistently show disrespect, if your words consistently tear people down, then your stated intentions are meaningless. The way Clint walked off that stage, with his head held high and his dignity intact, sent a clear message. He wasn't running away. He wasn't retreating in defeat. He was making a choice. He was choosing not to participate in something that didn't align with his values. He was choosing self-respect over the comfort of others. And in doing so, he showed far more strength than if he'd stayed and endured more insults. Norton was left to deal with the aftermath, sitting in front of an audience that had just watched him systematically alienate and insult a beloved icon. The awkwardness was palpable. The discomfort was universal. And his attempts to move forward with the show felt hollow and forced. You can't just bounce back from something like that. You can't treat someone so poorly, have them walk out on you, and then pretend everything's fine. The other guests on the couch that night were in an impossible position. They'd witnessed the whole thing. They'd seen Norton cross line after line. They'd watched Clint give him chance after chance to stop. And they'd ultimately seen a man stand up for himself and leave. What were they supposed to do with that? How were they supposed to pretend the show could just continue as normal? This whole incident serves as a reminder that fame and platform don't excuse bad behavior. Norton had the bigger stage that night. He had the home court advantage. He had the audience predisposed to be on his side. But none of that mattered when his behavior was so clearly out of line. All the advantages in the world can't protect you from the consequences of treating people poorly. Clint Eastwood didn't need to defend his legacy that night. His body of work speaks for itself. Decades of iconic performances, critically acclaimed directing, cultural impact that spans generations. Norton's cheap shots couldn't diminish any of that. But Clint still stood up and said no. This isn't acceptable, because some things matter more than just letting something slide for the sake of avoiding confrontation. The really instructive part of this whole exchange is what it reveals about different approaches to conflict. Norton's approach was to attack, to belittle, to try to elevate himself by pushing someone else down. Clint's approach was to stand firm in his values, to clearly articulate the problem, and to remove himself from a toxic situation. One approach seeks to dominate, the other seeks to maintain dignity. Throughout the entire confrontation, Clint gave Norton opportunities to change course. Every time Norton made a disrespectful comment, Clint could have immediately walked off. But he didn't. He responded calmly, first. He tried to redirect. He gave Norton the benefit of the doubt. It was only when it became absolutely clear that Norton wasn't going to stop, that the disrespect was intentional and ongoing, that Clint decided enough was enough. That patience, that willingness to give someone multiple chances, actually made his final decision to leave even more powerful. It showed that this wasn't a snap judgment or an overreaction. It was a carefully considered response to a pattern of behavior. It was the last resort after all other options had been exhausted. The silence that followed Clint's exit was perhaps the most damning part of the entire incident. It was the sound of everyone in that studio processing what they'd just witnessed. It was the sound of an audience grappling with the uncomfortable reality that they'd been complicit, through their nervous laughter, in something that shouldn't have happened. It was the sound of a show grinding to a halt, because the foundation it was built on, the assumed cooperation between host and guest, had completely crumbled. Norton's visible discomfort in those moments after Clint left revealed everything. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't a scripted bit or a playful exchange that got slightly out of hand. This was a genuine rejection, a public rebuke, a moment where someone with real power and influence told him, in front of everyone, that his behavior was unacceptable. There's no spinning that. There's no making it into a funny anecdote. It just sits there, heavy and undeniable. The lesson here extends far beyond this one incident. It's about how we treat people, especially when we have some kind of advantage over them. Norton had the power in that dynamic. He controlled the show, the questions, the flow of conversation, but he used that power poorly. He used it to punch down rather than to create something meaningful. And when someone with genuine strength and self-respect pushed back, all that apparent power evaporated. Clint Eastwood walking off that stage wasn't an ending. It was a statement. A statement about dignity, about respect, about knowing your worth, and not allowing anyone to diminish it. It was a statement that said, you don't have to accept poor treatment just because it comes from someone with a platform. It was a statement that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to participate. The image of Clint carefully removing his microphone, placing it down, and walking away with complete composure is the image of someone who knows exactly who they are and what they stand for. No amount of goading could make him lose his cool. No amount of insults could make him stoop to that level. He simply recognized a situation that was beneath him and removed himself from it. That's real power. That's real strength. Norton learned a hard lesson that night, or at least he had the opportunity to learn it. You can't hide behind the excuse of, it's just entertainment, when you're genuinely hurting people. You can't claim you're just doing your job when your job involves treating guests with contempt. And you can't expect people to endlessly tolerate disrespect just because you have a television show. The whole incident stands as a testament to the importance of treating people, all people, with basic decency and respect. It doesn't matter if they're famous or unknown, young or old, powerful or not. Everyone deserves to be treated like a human being. Everyone deserves to have their boundaries respected. And everyone has the right to walk away from situations where those things aren't happening. Clint Eastwood didn't need to make a dramatic scene to make his point. He didn't need to shout or threaten or insult Norton back. He just needed to stand up, state the truth, and leave. Sometimes the quietest actions speak the loudest. Sometimes the most powerful statement is simply refusing to engage with behavior that doesn't meet your standards. That night, in front of millions of viewers, Graham Norton learned that there are consequences to treating people poorly. He learned that not everyone will sit quietly and take abuse for the sake of entertainment. He learned that some people have lines that shouldn't be crossed, and when you cross them, you lose them. And most importantly, he learned that having a microphone and a platform doesn't make you untouchable. It just means more people are watching when you fail.